Hey everyone! Thanks for joining us for the next session of our RAG Deep Dive series, RAGChat, User Login and Data Access Control. My name's Anna. I'm an event planner for Reactor, joining you from Redmond, Washington. Before we start, I do have some quick housekeeping. Please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional and on topic. Keep an eye on that chat. We'll be dropping helpful links and checking for questions for our presenter to answer live. Our session is recorded. It'll be available to view on demand within 24 to 48 hours right here on the Microsoft Reactor YouTube channel. With that, I'll turn it over to our speaker today. Pamela, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our RAG Deep Dive series. I'm always really excited to give these sessions, and it's great to be able to interact with all of you. Today, we're going to be talking about user login and data access control. And you can get the slides yourself from this URL here, and we'll post that in the chat so that you can go ahead and bookmark that. And you're welcome to reference the slides. You're welcome to reuse the slides, pass them around, whatever you want to do. I'm Pamela Fox. I'm from the Python Cloud Advocacy team, and I'm one of the main speakers for this series. And I might also get joined by Matt Gottner from the Azure AI Search team, and we'll see if he's able to join us today. So for those of you new to the RAG Deep Dive series, this is a 11-part series. We are like a third of the way through it right now, and we are diving deep into our most popular RAG solution, which thousands of developers have used in order to make RAGChat applications on their own data. And so we're diving into all the different features of this repo and how to use it to have the most powerful RAG applications. As you can see today, we're talking about user login and data access control. We've already had 4 streams before this, and you can check out the recordings for that if you'd missed those. And you can register in order to attend any of our streams coming up here. We'll share the link in the chat for registering for the entire deep dive series. And you can also register for particular ones if there's ones that really, really catch your eye. Now, for those of you new to this series, I also want to give an overview of the RAG solution that we are discussing today. So we have, this is all an open source RAG solution, so you can look at the code yourself at this URL that we'll share in the chat. And it is a GitHub repo, of course. So it is Azure Search OpenAI demo is the repo. It's, as I'm saying, it's very popular. It's actually our most popular Azure sample and has been deployed thousands of times. It has many contributions. Maybe some of you in the chat have even contributed to it. And because of that, it also has many features. And we've worked through like lots of requests and issues that people have run into while using it. So this is the RAG solution that we're talking about in this series that we'll be using. And we do also have a deployed version of this that you can try. This is just the basic version without user login. I can't give you a URL to try out the user login version because you wouldn't be able to log in. But if you do want to try out the RAGChat application, just the basic functionality without login, you can go to the aka.ms/ragchat-demo, and you can go to the URL and you can see what happens with the sample questions. You can try asking other questions. The sample data is a bunch of fake HR documents for a company. And, you can see the answers that stream in and see the citations and get a gist of the basic functionality for it. All right. And this is the architecture of the basic app. This is what we'll be building on, right? So we have a front end, we have a back end. The back end's either on container apps or on Azure App Service. And then when we get in a request, we check to see if we have matching results in Azure AI Search. We get back those results, and those results are chunks from the documents. So we've already, split up and chunked these documents. And then we send those to the LLM in order to get a response that's grounded in that data. So today we're going to talk about how we can add all these user-based features to this RAGChat experience to really make it a much more personalized and internal experience, right? So we're going to first talk about adding user login, and then how to add data access control, and then how to handle user uploaded documents. And each of these features builds on each other, so it's a nice progression too. And if anytime you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If I'll try to address them after each section, and or if I know I'm going to answer them later, then I'll wait till later. But this is a live chat, so I do see whatever you're typing in the chat. And so if you see me look over, I'm looking to see what questions you have. All right, so let's get started with user login. So our goal is to be able to have this, user login. And so you can see, like in this one, I can see I'm logged in as Pamela Fox at Microsoft.com, and I can do a login, a log out. And I've got that. So I do have that demo here that I can use. If I gave you the URL, you would not be able to log in. So it wouldn't be a very satisfying experience. But many customers, like to have their user auth be dependent on, on their organization, right? So they can add user auth, have it restricted their organization, so that way only people within their organization can log into the application. So that's one technique in which we improve the security of an application, is by putting it behind a user auth login. The other technique is to do private network deployment, and we'll have a stream about that in the future. But this first technique is doing user auth, and that's a very popular technique. So here we are, we're logged in, and I could log out, I could log back in. If I log back in, it would be a very long process because I have to do like multiple forms of multi-factor authentication, because we have very secure accounts here at Microsoft, which is great, but it does take a long time. So I'm going to stay logged in. All right, so then we go to, let me move, I'm just going to move my doc over here. It keeps changing. Come over here. All right, here we go. Great. All right, so that's our goal. So the question is, how did we get to adding that login button and that login, log out experience, right? So the first thing we need to do is register with the Microsoft Identity Platform. And that's going to allow us to use the identity platform in order to add a login, log out experience. So when we register with the identity platform, we're going to create what's called a Microsoft Entra application object, and then also a Microsoft Graph service principal. So we make these two things, and they're actually associated with each other, so we kind of bundle them together. And so that Entra application object will say things like, oh, this application is allowed to log in for this domain, and it's allowed to redirect to this domain, and it's restricted to this organization, right? So it knows everything about what it's allowed to be used for. And then the service principal is associated with it. Now, this is actually a SPA application. So we've got this front end here, and the front end is written in React with TypeScript, and the front end makes API requests to a backend, and that backend is written in Python with the Quart framework. So this is a SPA application. And when we're doing user authentication for a SPA application, it is a bit trickier. It's a bit more work, because there's actually multiple applications involved. There's both the front end and there's the back end, and each of them needs their own Entra application that says what they can do, because they can actually do slightly different things. So that's what we're going to have, is an application for the front end and one for the back end. So what does this actual user login flow look like that we're adding to a SPA app? So generally, when we do user login for an app, we are using OAuth 2 with the OIDC protocol. So OIDC stands for OpenID Connect. OpenID Connect builds on OAuth 2. It's just a particular protocol that you can use on top of OAuth 2, but it builds on top of it. So that's what we're doing, is an OAuth 2 OIDC flow for this application. So what happens is, in the in the application, we go to the front end, and the front end checks to see if you're logged in and says, oh, okay, you're not logged in. So we're going to redirect to the login for your tenant, right? So for my application, it's going to go to my auth tenant and go to the login screen for that. And then, if my tenant requires 2FA, it's going to, make me use my 2FA app, use my passkey, whatever, right? So the cool thing is that, whatever your tenant is using for authentication, all of that is going to be handled by Microsoft Entra ID, right? So you, as the application developer, don't have to implement, doing a 2FA or a forgot password, like all of that user auth stuff. Like you don't have to implement any of that. That's going to be taken care of by Microsoft Entra ID, and it'll be based off of what's set up for your tenant, all the rules for your tenant. So we go to the tenant, and it logs us in, and if it's successful, then it passes a token back to the single page application. And then that application will send the token to the backend whenever it's making an API request to the backend. So it'll send along its request along with that token. And so then the backend is using something called the on behalf of flow. So the backend on behalf of that authenticated user is doing some operations, right? So it's actually going to get another token. So it's kind of going to do like a little token exchange here to get a different token that it can then use to call the Microsoft Graph API on behalf of that user. So that's what we mean by on behalf of flow, is that we're able to use that token in order to call an API for that user. So we can actually do like the /graph/me endpoint and get data for that user. So that's the general flow that we're using for this SPA login. Now, the question is, how do we implement this login? This login looks kind of complicated. We don't want to have to reinvent the wheel. We want to use whatever resources we can to make it easier to implement user login. So there's actually two different options. One of them is if you're doing authentication on Azure App Service or container apps, you can use what's called the built-in authentication feature. Sometimes it's also called Easy Auth. But if you look at the docs, it's the built-in authentication feature. And you can use it for either app service or container apps. And that will basically implement the OAuth flow for you. So it'll add a middleware between the user's request and your backend. So every request that comes into your app will go through that middleware, and it'll check to see, okay, is there a token for this person? Great. If there's a token, it can just forward it to your app. If there's not a token, then it's gonna, make you do the login flow, right? So that's the built-in authentication. So that's a great option if you only need user auth on your production endpoints, on your deployed endpoints. So really good if you just need to make sure that when something is deployed, it can only be used by users in your org. The other option is if you need to do user auth anywhere, so on any host, including local hosts. Because the thing about built-in auth is that you can't do it on localhost because localhost doesn't have that middleware, right? So if you needed to do anything complicated based off of the user auth state, you wouldn't be able to test it on localhost, which could be really difficult, right? So that's why I say you can use built-in auth when you only, if you only need it in production, then it's a good fit. For authentication on any host, including localhost, then you're going to use the MSAL packages. So MSAL stands for Microsoft Authentication Library, and there's packages in Python, .NET, JavaScript, .NET, all our usual languages. And that we can use to orchestrate that OIDC flow. Now, the interesting thing is in our RAGChat application, we actually use both of these options. And that might sound crazy. Why would you use both of those options? So first of all, we use option 2, the MSAL SDKs, because we need to test this stuff out locally. I actually have it running locally right now, and I've been testing stuff that have to do with user authentication all day. So so when I'm on localhost, right? So here I just went to the localhost. You can see I'm logged in on localhost, right? And on localhost, like I'm not on app service or container apps. I can't be using built-in apps, but that's okay because I can use the MSL SDKs and and get logged in. Should be in my cookie somewhere. So I need to be able to have that local development since we really have so many features that they're dependent on user auth. That's really important to have that local development experience. But we also use built-in auth because here's the thing is if you like with this local experience, at least the way we implemented it is that when you're local, you'll actually see the full app. Here, I'll log out here and to show what the experience is like. Let's see, it's a log out going to redirect me. You signed out, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So you can see what happens here. I'm on localhost. I go to the app and I do see the full application. So that's how we implemented this app is that locally, if you're logged out, you're going to see the full application. People don't always want this in production. In production, a lot of developers don't want people to see this at all. They want you to either see either go through the login or just see an authentication error. So that's what we can get when we use built-in auth, because you can configure built-in auth to say, hey, if they don't log in, show them nothing, or to just show them an error screen. So that's part of why we use built-in auth. Is the easiest way to kind of have this complete and utter door where you see nothing until you go through that door. So we use both, and it's a little trickier to use both because we have to check to figure out whether we're, using the built-in auth or the local auth, and a few things are different, but it does kind of get us the best of both worlds. All right, so let's look at this MSL JS code here. So in the client, we're going to be using the MSL JS SDK and using that to do login. So first we set that up with some authentication information. So we tell it our client ID. And that's for every Entra application you make, there'll be a client ID. So you can actually see, I have this open over here. So let's see, it's this one, Azure client. This one is the Azure client app ID. Now I can share this with you because the ID is not a piece of private information. And that's the thing is when you're using the MSL JS SDK for the front end, you want to make sure you're not revealing any secrets, right? You wouldn't want to put your client's secret in your front end code because anybody could view source and then look at your client secret, right? So this is what's called a public client application. And that's what we need to use when we're making code in the front end that's potentially viewable by anyone. So with public client application, we only pass in the ID, not the secret. And then we can tell it to acquire a token, and that'll do a pop-up login and go through the whole flow. And then it will give us back the ID token. So that's how we do it on the front end to get back that token. And then in the back end, which is using Python, and it's using the Quart framework. I saw that question came in. So we're using Python with Quart, but you could do this with any framework, with Fast API, Flask, etc. Django. Although Django, you might want to use the Django users, but certainly with Flask and Fast API. So in this one, we're setting up a confidential client application. So here, we're fetching our ID for the Entra application that's associated with the server. So remember, we have two Entra applications, one for the client, one for the server. So we're going to fetch the one for the server. Let me actually get you the exact code here. Confidential client. Here we go. Here we go. Yeah, so we're passing in the server app ID. And we're passing in the server app secret. All right, so remember, once again, we have two Entra applications, the client one and the server one. So we're going to create that confidential client application with the server app ID and the server app secret. We also pass in a token cache and the authority, which is like where we log into. That would have our tenant in it. So here you can see the authority would have our whatever tenant they're logging into. Then we set up we can set up the flow. and acquire a user. Now, this is what it looks like if you actually are doing a non-spa app. For us, we actually don't need to do this flow in the application. Instead, we are receiving the token from the client, and then we need to validate it and turn it into a good token. So let's go ahead and look at so we have this decorators.py that checks to see if the user is authenticated. So it looks at the headers. So if you're familiar with Flask, this is a decorator for the route. So if we look at let's go to our main code here, and if we search for this, so we see authenticated, 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 right? So lots and lots of paths, almost all the paths are authenticated actually. And that means that it's going to check to make sure that if user auth is enabled, that the current user is authenticated. So if we look at that, it will send in the headers, because the headers is going to have the token. Let me actually show you those headers. So here you can see get headers. Okay. So with the headers, we pass in the ID token that we got from the MSL.js SDK. We pass that in the authorization header. So we say authorization bearer ID token. So that's what we're sending to the backend. And then we send those headers to our authentication helper. And then we have this function here that looks through the headers to see if it can find the authorization header. And the first thing it has to do is validate the access token. This is actually really important, and people can sometimes forget to do this. So it's really important that you actually validate the token. Because remember, this is coming from the client, right? And a client can fake anything, really, right? You can't trust anything that comes from a client, from a front end, because all of that can always be faked, right? Like a user can go into the developer tools, they can send whatever they want, right? So they could send some gobbledygook token. So it's really important that we actually validate it. So this, this actually will call this key URL in order to validate it, and does a little bit of cryptography in order to verify the signature and check some audience and yada yada. So there's a lot of code here that does that validation. And this is because we're doing authentication for a spa application. This wouldn't be so much work if this was, just a server-side application. But it's a spa application, and many of you are using spa applications. So that's why I'm spending so much time on this, because, this app is a spa application. Even if you're not using this app, you might be using a spa application. So I think it's good to talk about it. So if we first validate that token, then we change that token into a token that we can use on behalf of the user. So now we're getting an access token for a particular resource. And then once we have that, then we can use that in order to access additional information about the user. We're using this in this case in order to check to see what groups the user's in. So we go out and say, hey, well, like groups, like directory groups, like you're part of, I'm part of like Python advocates and developer relations, right? So we go out and check to see what groups the user's in to make sure that we know both their ID and their groups. And then we have everything we need in order to proceed with the rest of the app, right? So we need to know the user's Entra ID, and we need to know their groups. Okay. So that's the backend. All right. So that's user login. So as you see, we've got the front end, and the front end gets the token, sends it to the back end validates it, gets the group information, and now we're good, and we know that the user can log in. And the front end displays the user's information here. All right. So let's see, any questions on that, on user login? There was a question about whether this app uses semantic kernel. This app, as mentioned in the chat from Ahmed, this app uses the Python OpenAI package, and it does not use any orchestration framework. So it doesn't use LangChain or semantic kernel or any of those frameworks. Just uses the OpenAI SDK. It also uses Prompty, which is a package for prompt management, basically. Those are the two main AI-related packages that it uses. But yeah, we haven't felt the need to use a framework. All right, so let's keep going with data access control. So now our goal is that we should be able to, now that we know what users are logged in and what groups they're part of, we should be able to limit documents in our index and say, hey, this document can be shared with this person, this document can be shared by that person, etc. So this is, kind of what it looks like. This was a screenshot from a version of the app where my user didn't have access to the information about a product manager, like what a product manager does in the organization. And so then I got back a response that says, I'm sorry, but I couldn't find any information about what a product manager does in the provided sources. So that's our goal, is that we want to be able to have docs in our search index that have access controls associated with them so that we can decide what people can see or not see. Now, there's a couple different options for how to set this up. So in this one, I had it set up so that basically I would have to explicitly give permission for each doc to each user or group. In the other one that I'm running right now, I actually can get an answer to this question because I've got it configured with this other option, which is enable global document access. So you can see that's true. So with this option, if there's a document in the index that doesn't have any access controls associated with it, then users are allowed to see it. So it just depends on whether in your index you want to be able to have a bunch of documents that anyone can access without you having to like add on explicit ACLs, or if you want to make sure that everything is super explicit and that the only way somebody sees something is if their ID or their group is on the ACL. All right, so how does this work? So this is the change in the architecture. So there's only really basically one change here, at least in the RAG flow, is that when we get the request in, we actually add a user filter and we say, okay, when we're looking in Azure AI Search, we're only going to retrieve the chunks that can be seen by this user. So that's the main difference. So how do we do that? So first, we were saying that we've got access to a token, right? And with that token, we can see both the OID of the user and their groups. And that's the information that we're going to use. So this is what's in an access token. So this is for my colleague, Matt. So you can see, his Entra OID. So the Entra OID is the way that you should be identifying users. Do not use email address. Don't use name for sure. I think you already know that, but also don't use email address. Email addresses can change. They're not considered like a secure, stable form of identification. The only ID you should use for a user is their Entra OID. And in the app, I can actually see for the logged in user, all my claims. So these are all the claims for my logged in user. So you can see it does tell me my email address, and that's what I use for display. So it's totally fine to use that for display, but not for actual, authentication security. We can see the provider, that's my tenant, and there's my OID, object identifier. So that is my unique identifier that can be used to identify me stably. And yeah, if you have a token, you can go to this fun website. I think it's fun, jwt.ms, and you can go and actually paste it in. Oh, let me see if I can actually, if I do a little request here, let's see, I'm going to clear the chat. I'm going to send another one. See if I can grab my token from the headers. I'm trying to see if I can get it from the headers here. Let's see, authorization. Where is it in my cookie? That's my app service auth session. Oh, it's not showing me the authorization one. That's probably good. It's not showing it. Okay, but if you do have one of your tokens, when you're debugging, you can paste the token into here and it will show you all the claims in it, which is a fun tool. All right, so we've got this token and it has all that information and we can use it for whatever. I see Kalayan asked, can we use the identity and access token to check the role of the user? That's a good question. I mean, when you say role, let's see, what do I have in mind? Because these are all the ones in my current one, right? Tenant ID, name, SID, object ID. So I don't see anything like roles in here. So I'm not sure. That's a good question. Well, you can't, we can get the groups, right? So we get the groups, we get the OID. Maybe there, I wonder if there's like maybe a Microsoft Graph API for roles. I'm not sure. I haven't worked with roles before. If there is directory roles. Okay, so there's this one. This might be, maybe this is be the one. If there's a Graph API for it, then you could do, you know, like what we're doing here. Right here, we're making a request to the Graph SDK and checking to see if they're in anymore, right? So here we say, give us all the groups that this user is a member of. So if there is a Graph SDK, Graph API method that would give you back the roles, then what you could do is use that on the back end and add that role information. So that's a really good question. Can the token be passed around from system to system carrying the identity with it? Well, this is a Microsoft Entra OID. So when you say system to system, oh, and the token is, I think the token is like really tied to your application. So I'm not sure. I don't actually know. I would think that another app wouldn't. Well, wait, so we can decode the token, carrying the identity with it. So, I mean, this can clearly decode the token and get the claims. So, yes. Depends exactly what we mean by that. You should, like, if you're using Microsoft Entra, you should be like sticking all with Microsoft Entra, you know, and assume, because the OID is unique to Microsoft Entra, but that OID I would assume would not be unique across all possible identity providers, right? So if we were bringing in other identity providers, then I would think we'd want to find a way of saying like, okay, this OID is from this identity provider and this OID is from this other identity provider. But that's a really, really good question. Looks like we have some answers in the chat too. Great. Yeah. So those of you who are more familiar with Entra in particular, it'd be great to give your perspectives as well. Okay. So we have access to the OIDs and the groups. So what we do is on the Azure AI Search Index, we add in the OIDs as basically a list. So a list type field, and we say it's filterable. So we say, okay, it's a list of strings and it can be filtered. So that's really important that we add that filterable, because that's going to make it so we have fast searches for it later and the ability to search for it, filter for it. And then we also add groups the same way. So that means every document chunk can be associated with a list of OIDs and a list of groups. And then when we do an actual filter, when we do a request, when we're searching for something to match the document, we use this operator called search.in. So we say, okay, and this is a crazy looking syntax, and Matt's the one that wrote this, and I don't know if I would have been able to write the syntax. It has a particular name. I think it's the OData syntax that this is, but it says, okay, the OIDs can match any of these like things here, right? So we say, okay, does it match this, this, or this? And then the groups can match any of these here. Now, when we're actually doing this in the app, we're only looking for one OID because only one user is logged in at a time, but they could be a part of multiple groups. So we are checking for potentially multiple groups, right? So we're looking like find all the documents that have this OID or have any of these groups. That's basically the query we want to do. So we can actually see the query when we go over here and look at the thought process. In the thought process tab, so the thought process helps us, understand and debug what's going on. So we can see the filters that go through on the back end. So let me go ahead and make this way bigger. Okay, actually, I'll just go ahead and put it in a new file so we can make it really big. And then we're going to word wrap. All right, we're going to move this. Okay. Let's try and make this really big. Okay, so what you can see here is that we're searching for I think it's Python. Okay, we're searching for my OID. So we're checking to see, like, find any document that has this OID in the OIDs field, and find any document that has this group. So I guess I'm only in one group. So it's finding any document that has this group. And because we have that option to enable global document access, it also says, okay, also find any document that doesn't have any OIDs or groups associated. So that's what this additional query does, is like finds back, documents that have no ACLs at all. If you enable the other option that's more restrictive, then your filter is just going to look like this. And so it's only going to get back ones that explicitly match your OIDs. So then when we look back at the results here, we can see, so for the example here, with the product manager question, that actually has no OIDs and no groups, right? So that matched this part of the query here, the or not, because it was able to retrieve that. But let me go ahead and ask a question about plants, which is only I care. So it's only in my index. Does a ceanothus like the sun? Okay. A ceanothus is a type of native plant. Okay. That's interesting. So it found the sources. It didn't like answering the question this time, even though it answered it right before I streamed. Well, with LLMs, they can be really particular. Does the ceanothus should a ceanothus be in sun or partial sun? Any like subtle change. And this is my ceanothus. This is just an excuse to show a picture of my ceanothus right now because it's really beautiful. It's really blooming. Okay, and there we got a perfect response. A ceanothus can be in either full sun or partial sun. I think it didn't like saying whether it likes it, because it doesn't want to say that a plant likes anything, because we don't know anything about the inner lives of plants. But here wording it as, should it be in sun or partial sun, we got a response. Now, if we look at the thought process for this, we can see that once again, it sent off that filter. And if we look at the documents, you can see that this ceanothus document only has my OID on it, right? So I am the only one that can query about ceanothus, at least for this document, because only my OID is on that document. Oh yeah. So okay, and as you see, I'm not in any groups. I haven't assigned any groups here, but I could also assign groups. Like if there's a particular document that a group could see, you could assign the group, and then I would have seen that there. And yes, so great comment from Ahmed. So you can include the groups claim in the Entra token. So the issue with that is, so we do that. However, the reason we do this list groups is because apparently there's a limit. It's what's called overage. So it says a group's claim may have been admitted either because it wasn't added in the application management or a group's overage claim. So from what we understood, there's this possibility that at some point you, I'll post this in the chat. At some point you may not get all the groups in that's like if your token is too big. So this is kind of a just in case situation. Like so it says like if your token size is too big, let me open this over here so you can see. So yeah, if the number of object IDs is limited, if it's over 150 or 200, it's not included. Instead, you get an overage claim. So most of the time, we don't have to do that additional graph call, but sometimes we do. And so when we do, that's why we have all that complicated code, right? Like this thing, like things always like start off simple, and then you find out about the edge cases, and you're like, oh, okay, we're gonna have to check to see if it went over, and if so, we have to go out and make a request. But that's a great point. Is that most of the times you shouldn't run into this. I mean, you saw like I was only in one group in my example. But I haven't actually checked to see with my normal tenant, because this is a special tenant I'm using for demo. I'm assuming my normal tenant, I actually probably am in a decent number of groups. Don't know if I'm in 200, but potentially I could imagine somebody in a big org being in 200 groups. Okay, and I see Rajesh asked, where are the OIDs for the document set? Yeah, so that's a great question. We're gonna be covering that. next, because we have two different ways that we can do that. So there's a couple possibilities. So one way that we could set the OIDs is that we can just actually run a script. So we have this script manage acl.py, and we can just run it to, let me look at the docs for it, blah, 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 right? So we have all these examples here. So if you want to add an ACL for a particular document, you could run that script and say, okay, this is the OID, and this is the URL of the document they have access to, right? So it would then give access to, to that group or that OID for that document. So it will go through and find all the documents in the index that match it, and then it will update the OIDs or the groups for those documents. So that's one approach, and it's certainly possible. It's can be a bit manual because you're going to be running this command for each of them. You could script it, of course, but it's one option, and it's what some people use. And basically what it's doing is that, we go through, and for whatever was specified, we can say, hey, for this document, you're going to add this OID, you're going to add this group, and it can do the updates pretty quickly for the AI search index. There's another approach that some people use where you combine AI search with data lake v2 storage. So the idea here is that we have this product called Azure Data Lake Gen 2 Storage, which is basically blob storage, but hierarchical with permissions. So it's kind of you took a directory system and you put it online with all the ability to do, schmodding, permission setting, that sort of thing. So, in this example here, we have this My Documents folder, and we can say, oh, this user has the ability to read this group has the ability to read and execute, right? So you can set up all these folders and files and permissions and say exactly which users and which groups have read, write, or execute permissions. So what you could do is start with your data in that ADLS container, and then you can basically make an AI search index based off of that data lake container. So we have code for that as well that will, go through and check the ACLs in the container and reflect those ACLs in the index. So that's in the AWS Gen 2 setup code here. And that would be another option. So those are our two main options that we've come up with so far. And, please give feedback on them. I know there's a few open issues about ADLS 2 and just making sure that this ADLS 2 strategy works well with everything else, all the other features in the repo, because we have so many other features in the repo. And I think we need to just update it to account for everything. But those are the two general approaches that we've come up with. Great. All right. So yeah, once again, knowing that, looking at the two options, right? So what is your life cycle, right? So the first one, is that you ingest from data lake, and it already has those access control lists. So then when you put them in the index, they already have their ACLs, and that's all going to be working. The second option is that you ingest them without access control, and then, immediately run a script in order to add those ACLs. And, that might be a good one for testing, or if you somehow automate it. But you certainly want to think about how it's going to work before that the ACLs are in there, and make sure that you're only revealing documents to people who should see them. Now, sometimes we get asked, why wouldn't you just use an index per user? And one of the answers is that AI search does have limitation, which means there's a finite number of indexes per search service, right? Here you can see for free, it's 3, basic is 15, S1 is 50, right? And if you go to the biggest one, it's 3,000 per service. Now, if your organization has more than that number of users, and I think many of us have organizations that have more than that many users, then that's just not a good option, right? Because as soon as you go, even if you went all the way to S3HG, which is going to be really expensive, you still only have a max of 3,000 indexes. So it's really not designed with the idea of doing an index per user. Okay, so that is adding data access controls Let me make sure that we covered the questions here. So, oh yeah, and just to reiterate, so Sadiq asked, is the permission set at the chunk index level or at the entire doc level? So that's a great question. So the thing is that when we store, right, so when you run like a command, like the manage ACL command, you're running it based off of at the document. You're saying, this is the document that I want to send those ACLs for. But that's going to update multiple chunks, because in our search index, we have a bunch of chunks, and each of those chunks has its, its own OIDs and groups. So when we index things, we do it based off of, the actual file level, like, or the URL level here. But in the actual index, you're going to find a bunch of chunks for that particular document. So kind of both would be the answer there. Okay. All right. So then let's go to finally user uploaded documents. So this is a feature that builds on top of the previous features. That was something we could add once we had those. Now this feature, you can see here, like it gives me this manage file uploads in the UI, and then I can click on it and I can see all my uploaded files, and I can choose to upload a file. And these uploaded files stay for me persistently until I delete them. So, if I log in today, I see them. If I log in tomorrow, I'll see them as well. And they'll only change if I decide to delete them. This is different from other, like there's another type of user uploaded document experience that people have asked about, which is being able to attach a document to a particular question and only ask questions about the document in that session. We don't have that feature yet. We've discussed it, on the repo. It would be a fairly different feature to implement. But this feature is basically adding like a more permanent user-specific index or user-specific documents. And this feature requires data lake. So we said for this one, we're just going to go ahead and make a data lake container for it because it's a really good fit for this feature, and you'll see why. All right, so let's look at the steps of uploading a document. So actually, let me go ahead and show it in the UI. All right. So here we go. As usual, I will be uploading something about plants. So here we go. You can see it says uploading files. It says file uploaded successfully, and it shows up on my list here. And if I want to, I can choose to delete any of these. All right, so now we can ask a question. What insect is on are on lupines? Because I just uploaded something about lupines, so maybe it'd be able to tell me that. Okay, it says there's nothing about it, but let's see what it got back. It did get back the lupine one. Let's see. Does any butterfly like, actually it's more the bees, but let's find out. Does any butterfly like lupines? I'm uploading really, really simple documents, so the questions I can ask about them are also pretty simple. That's cool. I've never even heard of that butterfly. So now I can click on the citation and see where it got that answer from, right? And it says, okay, there's the Ackman blue butterfly. There you go. And yeah, so there we go. And that was the file upload experience. So I could also ask about any of the previous things too, right? Because you can see I uploaded the whole Wikipedia page for Paris, because why not, right? So we can say like, okay, tell me a few museums from Paris. Maybe I'm going on a trip to Paris and I want to be able to check what other museums I should see beside the Louvre. Wow, it's giving me a lot here. Picasso. Wow. All right. There's a lot. Cool. So these are ones that only I can ask questions about, assuming that only I have, uploaded the Paris Wikipedia, right? All right. So how does this work? So I select a document from my computer and I store that immediately in a data lake container. And I store that in a directory based off the user's Entra ID. And that directory has permissions for that user ID as well. So we say, okay, that user, this is the user's directory. This is where we're going to put everything for them. And that user, has, read and write for it. So we add it to that directory there. Then we send it through our usual data ingestion process. So this is the same data ingestion process we use for uploading documents normally. So we get all the information. We extract all the text from it. We split the text. We embed the text, and we index it. And at the moment that we index it, that's when we make sure that we're specifying our own OID in the OIDs field, and then making sure it's pointing to the storage URL, which is on this data lake account. And those are like the main things that are different when we store these in the index, but we're pointing it in the main index just tied to that user. And so here you can actually see I've got my user storage container open, so I can show you just what it looks like when you're working with this, right? So I think this is the one. Yeah, and so this has the ones I just uploaded, right? So you can see that they're stored here, and it has everything matching what we see in this list here. So that's, I think, a really cool use of data lake storage, and it really fits it really well. And it builds exactly upon our access control feature from earlier. So it just works really well with it. This is what the code looks like on the server, right? So we get back the file. We check to see if there's a user directory for the user yet. If so, we use it. Otherwise, we make a directory for the user and set the access control for that directory. Then we read in the file, send that file through our data ingestion process. And then we say, oh, make sure you add on these OIDs when you index it. That's our code for uploading. Okay, so that is user uploads. That's actually the last thing I was going to show for this topic today. And if there's any additional questions, I did manage to end a little early, which is cool. So yeah, so any other questions? I'll just wait a few minutes to see. I'll actually just show the upload code directly here. It's a little easier to see, I think. Right, so we get the directory or make it, set the access control, upload the data to data lake, and then index that file and specify the user's OID. All right, and as a teaser for the one coming up on Wednesday, we're going to be talking about chat history, and I can show you chat history because we were adding to it all today. You can see all my questions about flowers. So we're going to be talking about this on Wednesday. So if you're interested in the chat history feature, do come on Wednesday. We are actually working on a big backend refactor of it. So there's going to be a change going through on the repo in the next day before the stream. So definitely come on Wednesday if you're interested in this chat history feature. And yeah. All right. So let's talk about what else is coming up. So we've got chat history on Wednesday, and then next week we're doing speech input and output, including voice RAG, which is very cool, real time. We'll do private deployment. We'll have evaluations, monitoring, and then function calling. And we also have office hours. So on Thursdays, I hold office hours in our AI Discord. So if you have any additional questions, you want to dive deep into something, you want to watch me just mess around with my app and try things, come to the office hours in Discord on Thursdays. We've had some great questions during those. And yeah, register for the rest of the sessions. Cool. How to join the Discord? Yeah, if you click this link, it should give you a little invite. Let me show you what it looks like. So you can see here, it'll say accept invite. I'm already in this community, but I think this is also what it would look like if you weren't in the community. It's a public community, so anyone can join it. So we say accept invite, and now it's going to open it. I closed it before the stream because generally it's a good idea to not have, two different streaming apps open at the same time. And now it's installing updates, which of course it would do. But that's the general process: is to click on that, accept the invite, and then open it up. And Thursdays at 12:30 PT, I'll be streaming from the stage in that Discord. Here we go. It's still opening. I got a question. So we do have a random question from James. How can you pick the model the RAG has, like Claude, OpenAI, etc.? It's a really good question. So you can definitely pick from any different OpenAI models, any different chat models, right? So if we look at, let's see, enabling optional features, this has instructions for the most common ones, which is GPT-4, GPT-4o, and GPT-4o mini. I don't think you could switch to O1 because I think the API is different, but I haven't actually tested it to see what the compatibility is like between O1 and these other ones. I think it'd also be really expensive. But we've lots of people who do switch, like try out different of the OpenAI chat models. Now, I've also used this with Ollama models locally. So it is possible to try out different local models with Ollama, but there are some issues because every model has a few things that are different about it, right? So for example, we do function calling, and OpenAI supports a particular form of function calling. If you're going to be using a different model, it would also have to support that same function calling API. Now, luckily, Ollama decided to add an OpenAI compatible function calling layer. So we are able to use some, we can use like Llama 3.1 with this one because it does support function calling in Ollama. But that's one thing you need, right? You need function calling to work and to be work in an OpenAI compatible way, because we do use the function calling feature. It would need so everything would have to be OpenAI compatible, because this repo uses the OpenAI SDK and assumes that everything is going to be following an OpenAI compatible endpoint, which the main thing is, can it do chat completions? Can it do streaming? Can it do function calling? The other issue is token counting. So we do token counting. And I have a library that I've made that we use in the repo, the OpenAI messages token helper, and that counts the tokens. And the reason that we do token counting is because we're trying to make sure we stay under the context window for an app, right? So, because we can do like follow-up questions, right? So like our conversation can keep going for a while. So imagine we had like 30 questions in here. If we sent those all to the LLM, like we could go over the context window, right? So this token counting library knows how to count things for OpenAI models. It does not know how to count things for Claude models, for example. So that's something that I haven't figured out, is that if we were going to add compatibility with non-OpenAI models, how would we handle things like function calling, token counting, etc.? I haven't seen anyone come up with cross model token counting. Or you could just decide not to care. You could say, well, whatever, I don't care about token counting. I've got a huge context window. It's almost never going to go over. That would be the other approach. And maybe that's what we'll get to as context windows get bigger and bigger. But right now, that's where it's at. So Site asks, is there a version difference? I can't see managed file uploads. Yeah. So if you're checking the demo URL that I gave earlier, that's just the basic one that doesn't have any of the optional features enabled. And so it doesn't have managed file uploads, because managed file uploads depends on you having user auth. And right now the user auth is specific to organization. Like we don't have like just public facing user auth. So I can't share that demo with you. Because you won't be able to log in because you're not a part of my organization. So for file uploads, you have to, imagine it. No, you have to set it up for yourself in order to be able to try it out. Hopefully in the future, we'll add onto external ID, because then you could set it up so that anyone could log in with like a password. And that's definitely been a feature request. It's just I need to find some time to write the code. But it's definitely possible like that. And I know other developers have set this up with Entra External ID. So in the future, we should make it so that you can easily set it up with Entra external ID. And that way I could also have a demo that I could share with all of you that you could just log in with, like a SMS or whatever. But need to write that code first. Ahmed asked about using the OpenAI Assistant API. We haven't felt the need for it yet. It doesn't seem like we haven't felt like it had enough benefits. There's always flexibility issues when using a higher level thing. So right now it's not like something we're considering in the short term. And then Sunny asked, I have a use case where I don't want a RAG app to return any financial advice. Interesting. Is it a good idea to use a cheat model to figure out if response has financial advice and filter it? You could do that. I mean, the other thing you can do is heavy prompt engineering and then run a lot of evaluations in order to figure out whether it does still get convinced to return it. Like you could even use we have something called the adversarial simulator. I actually need to use it in the future, which tries to like break your app basically. You might be able to customize it. So yeah, certainly if you can do a cheat model that's fast enough to filter it out, or if you can even like force your model to respond, right? Because you could also use function calling and say like, oh, return with a Boolean equals true if this has financial data. So yeah, there's lots of different approaches there. I guess I would be first want to try prompt engineering and like not having to add an additional model, because as soon as you add an additional model, like that's more cost for you and more latency, right? So with user facing RAG flows, I'm like hesitant to add another model, but you could try. So first of all, like every time I ask a question here, we have a first stage, which is the query rewriting stage. And that would be the stage where I would like add a Boolean to say like, does this contain financial data, right? So in the query rewriting phase, let's see, it's query rewrite tools. Okay. So we say we use function calling and we say, okay, you're going to suggest an optional search query, but you could add on a thing that says like has financial advice, right? And this would be a Boolean, right? So that's the first thing I would do, at least with this setup where we're already doing a query rewriting stage, is I would throw that, an additional Boolean or function into this function call and see if it accurately detects when there's financial advice. And then you could try different models. You could try prompt engineering, do evaluation. So yeah, lots of interesting things there. Okay, Tom asked, will we cover GraphRag in the future sessions? We aren't covering GraphRag in the future sessions because we don't have support for it in this repo yet. I think some folks have been messing with it. So, hopefully in the future, we will have the ability to talk about GraphRag for this repo. But as far as I know, currently we don't have a way that integrates GraphRag with this repo. I have used Ragas with it. So we'll talk about Ragas in evaluation, and Ragas does something similar to GraphRag. Is there a roadmap in place for future features? Yeah, that's a great question. We don't have a public roadmap. I've thought about that. But really, if you just ask me, I can, say what we're currently prioritizing and thinking about. And, if there's something in particular you're thinking about. I wish this was my full-time job. This isn't quite my full-time job. I also maintain like 100 other repos and stuff. So it'd be cool if it was my absolute full-time job because it's really, really fun. But we're able to do quite a lot of work on this, and we get lots of contributions from the community, all of you. So that means we can improve things. Sunny asked, what is heavy prompt engineering? Yeah, that's a good question. Like using every trick in the book, like, you'll be fined $100 if this contains financial advice. I know, it's like stuff like that, right? Like people can go to like a lot of extremes to like really force the app to follow its whims. You can also try like better models too. Those are usually better. But yeah, the best thing to do is like, if you're doing prompt engineering, you should definitely run evaluations. My experience is that whenever I try to do prompt engineering and I think I've got a clever new prompt and then I run evaluations, I'm like, oh, I didn't actually improve it. So prompt engineering is hard to be legitimate. So that's a great call out there. Yeah. Okay, great. All right. Those are awesome follow-up questions. Now I'm over. So thank you everybody for joining, and I hope to see you on Wednesday for chat history. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thanks, Pamela. Our session is a part of a series. To register for future shows and watch past episodes on demand, you can follow the link on the screen or in the chat. We're always looking to improve our sessions and your experience. If you have any feedback for us, we would love to hear what you have to say. You can also find that link on the screen or in the chat. Today's event code is 24574, and we will see you at the next one.